I was in the living room, folding laundry. Just a regular afternoon, nothing special. The hum of the washing machine and the rustle of fabric was the soundtrack to my usual routine. I thought about the quiet, predictable life I'd carved out with my husband, and how peaceful, in its own way, it had become. The kind of life where everything runs on autopilot, until it doesn't. "Mom, can you help me with something?" came a voice from the hallway. It was my stepson, calling me like he'd done many times before. But this time, something felt different. His tone wasn't the usual polite ask, it carried a hint of frustration. I set down the towels, thinking he probably needed help with some technical issue, his car, or maybe his phone. But when I turned the corner, I saw him standing at the bottom of the stairs, struggling with his belt. His khaki pants were sagging awkwardly around his hips, and the leather strap was stuck in the buckle. "Can you fix this? It's stuck, I think," he said, a little out of breath, taking a step towards me. I nodded and approached, reaching out to untangle the strap. I concentrated on the task, not really thinking about anything else. But as I worked, something odd happened. The belt slipped free, and in that instant, his shorts, they dropped. I froze for a split second, my eyes catching more than I ever intended to see. His hands hovered awkwardly around his waist, his face flushed red. "Sorry," he muttered quickly, pulling the shorts back up, his voice barely audible. I stepped back, my heart racing. It wasn't intentional. Not at all, but in that brief moment, everything changed. "It's fine. It happens," I managed, though my voice felt strange. He nodded hastily, a quick "thanks," before turning and darting upstairs, leaving me standing there, trying to make sense of what just happened. The room felt different. Quiet, yes, but heavy. The air seemed to have shifted, and though I knew it was a simple, accidental moment, nothing more than that, it had already planted a seed. A shift in the dynamic between us that I wasn't sure how to handle. It's funny, isn't it? How the smallest thing can set everything in motion. A misplaced glance, a second of awkwardness, and suddenly the whole landscape changes. I tried to dismiss it, of course. It was just a mistake. But deep down, I felt it. Something had changed. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pretend nothing had changed. I carried on with my days, tending to the house, running errands just like before. But deep down, something felt different. My husband, Michael, was as distant as ever, caught up in his golf trips, work dinners, and endless meetings. The silence between us was thick, suffocating almost, and I had gotten used to it. Our marriage wasn't bad, it was just comfortable. And that comfort, as comforting as it was, felt like it was slipping away. Then there was him, my stepson, Ethan. I'd known him since he was just a teenager, quiet, polite, distant. The boy who would come over on holidays, barely saying a word, awkward and unsure of how to act around me. But now he was different. He'd graduated college recently, and it was like something had clicked. He wasn't that shy kid anymore. There was a new confidence in him, a maturity that I hadn't seen before. He would join me in the garden sometimes, early in the morning when the sun was still soft, bringing me coffee, talking about his artwork, his struggles, his plans. Little by little, he started filling up the silence in the house in a way that Michael never could. There was something about him, his presence, his openness, that made everything else feel so still. One morning, I was trimming the hedges when he appeared, barefoot, holding a steaming cup. His hair was a mess, and he had that sleepy, content smile on his face. "Early start," I commented, half laughing, looking up from my work. He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone's got to admire your hard work." I smiled back, a little amused. "Don't let Michael hear you say that. He thinks the garden just takes care of itself." "Maybe it does," he said with a grin, then handed me a small stack of papers. I took them, surprised. "What's this?" "Just some sketches. I thought you might like them," he said quietly, his eyes avoiding mine for a moment. I flipped through the pages, portraits, landscapes, abstract designs. They were incredible. "These are amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "You should show these to someone. A gallery maybe, an art director. You've got real talent, Ethan." He met my eyes then, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the first person who said that." There was a weight in his words, something that lingered longer than I expected, something unspoken, but understood between us. It was the first time I saw him as more than just my husband's son. He wasn't the boy I'd known before. After that morning, things between Ethan and me became more complicated. It wasn't like we talked about it, or even acknowledged what had shifted, but every interaction felt charged in a way it hadn't before. There was a new awareness in the air, something unspoken that both of us seemed to be dancing around, too afraid to confront directly. But it was there, lingering. Ethan started spending more time at home, and not just for the usual obligatory family dinners. He'd show up unexpectedly, leaning against the doorframe while I was doing laundry, hanging around the kitchen when I was cooking, offering to help with small tasks around the house. Sometimes he'd even stay late, just sitting with me, talking about his art or life or nothing at all. I didn't mind. I welcomed the company. After all, Michael had become more of a ghost in the house than a husband. One afternoon, while I was in the garden, Ethan appeared behind me again, as quietly as ever. He handed me a cup of coffee, just like that first morning. But this time, something felt different. I could feel his presence more than I saw it. It was like I wasn't just looking at my stepson anymore. "You're always out here," he said, his voice breaking through the silence. "It's peaceful," I replied, keeping my focus on the roses I was tending to. "I like it out here." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I think you like avoiding me." I froze, my heart beating just a little faster. I wasn't sure how to answer. But then, somehow, I turned around to face him. His eyes were dark, intense, and I felt something stir deep inside of me. "I'm not avoiding you," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, looking at me. And then he stepped closer. His breath caught, and before I could process what was happening, it happened. It wasn't a kiss I planned, or even wanted at first. But once it happened, I didn't pull away. It felt like an explosion of everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When we pulled apart, I stumbled over my words. "We can't. We shouldn't." But he was already shaking his head, his gaze holding mine. "I don't want to forget this, Sophia. I can't." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him we couldn't do this wasn't right, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the world around me had just shifted, and there was no going back. The days after that kiss were a blur. I told myself it was a mistake, that it was just one moment of weakness, and I tried to convince myself it would never happen again. But as much as I tried to push it away, that moment kept replaying in my mind, over and over, like a song I couldn't get out of my head. Ethan, too, seemed to carry the weight of that kiss. It wasn't like before, where he'd hang around casually, slipping in and out of my day. Now there was a new tension between us. We both acted like nothing had happened, but the air between us was heavy with unspoken things. I found myself avoiding him, trying to keep my distance, but there was no escaping it. He was always there, in the same house, always just around the corner. We couldn't escape the quiet but palpable pull that had formed between us. Then one afternoon, while I was tending to the garden again, he appeared, just like the first time. This time, there was no coffee. He didn't need to bring anything. He just stood there watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge him. "You're out here again," he said, his voice quieter than usual, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile between us. "I like it here," I replied, not looking at him. My hands were busy with the flowers, trying to ignore the knot that had formed in my stomach. "I think you're avoiding me," he said again, his voice a little more insistent this time. I finally looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. He stepped closer, and before I could stop him, his hand was on my shoulder, gently turning me toward him. I felt my breath catch as he leaned in, and once again the world seemed to fade around me. It happened again, brief but intense. It wasn't planned, but it just did. Afterward, we both stood there, unsure of what to do. caught in the same moment we couldn't seem to escape. But the weight of it settled in quickly. It was wrong. I knew it. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't bring myself to pull away. The flood of emotions that followed overwhelmed me, and all I could do was stand there, silently, knowing we had crossed a line we could never uncross. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point, and it felt like we were all walking on eggshells. Michael had become more distant than ever. I tried to keep up the appearance of a happy family, but I could feel the weight of his suspicion growing with each passing day. The quiet glances he shot at Ethan and me were enough to make my stomach churn. It was only a matter of time before he figured it out. He was sharp, and he knew something was off. One night, after a quiet dinner, Michael caught me in the kitchen. His gaze was steady, searching. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his tone casual but with an underlying edge. "Is everything okay?" I froze. The words caught in my throat, but I couldn't lie to him. Not now. "I'm fine, Michael, just tired," I replied, offering him a forced smile. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press me any further. Instead, he turned away and walked out of the room, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my chest. I knew that deep down, he had sensed something wasn't right. But he hadn't put the pieces together yet. I told myself I had time, but I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, I went to bed with my mind racing. Thoughts of Ethan, thoughts of Michael, the kiss we shared. It all felt like it was consuming me. What had we done? What was I supposed to do now? I knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened. The guilt was overwhelming. But what scared me more was the thought of losing everything. Then came Claire. She'd been around more lately, dropping by the house, always under the guise of work. But I saw through it. She was watching me, watching all of us. I wasn't sure what she knew, but I could feel her eyes on me, always calculating, always waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, one evening, she cornered me in the hallway. Her eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else there, something dangerous. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I could tell she knew. "I think you've got something to confess," she said softly, her words a quiet threat, though her voice remained calm. I didn't respond. I couldn't. What was there to say? I was trapped. We all were. But then, just as I was about to walk away, she dropped the bomb. "I'll make sure he knows the truth," she whispered, the words chilling me to the core. I turned and walked away, my heart racing, not knowing what she meant, but feeling the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't just the guilt anymore. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught. It was something deeper, something I couldn't escape. And I didn't know if I wanted to. The next day, everything came crashing down. Michael sat me down in the study, his face pale, his eyes hard. "I know," he said simply. "I know about you and Ethan." I didn't know what to say. I felt the ground beneath me give way as his words hit me like a ton of bricks. The silence between us was suffocating. He looked at me, but his gaze wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with disappointment. The kind of disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation could. I opened my mouth to say something, to explain, but nothing came out. I couldn't explain this. There was no excuse for what had happened. There was no way to fix it. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it hit me harder than anything else. And for what? A fleeting moment? A mistake? I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was sit there, frozen, feeling the weight of my actions, knowing that there was no way to undo the damage I'd caused. And then he stood up, his expression hardening. "Get out," he said, his voice cold. "I can't look at you right now." I didn't fight him. I couldn't. I stood up, walked to the door, and left the study without a word. I didn't even look back. As I walked down the hall, my mind raced, my chest tight with regret. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I even had a choice anymore. The door to Ethan's room was open, and I saw him standing there, his back to me. He hadn't heard me approach, but I could see the way his shoulders tensed when I stepped into the room. I didn't know what to say to him either. We were both trapped in this mess, but it felt like neither of us could escape. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next, But then Ethan turned around. His eyes were filled with fear, regret, and something else, something deeper. I could see the same emotions reflected in my own eyes. "It's over," I said, the words heavy, the reality of them settling in my chest. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. I turned to leave, but just before I reached the door, I heard him call my name. "Sophia," he said, his voice breaking, and for a moment I hesitated. I didn't know what he wanted, but I couldn't face him anymore. I walked out of the room, out of the house, and into the night. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my choices. Not because of the secrets I'd kept, but because of the lives I'd changed forever. Sometimes the things we think we can control end up controlling us, and I had no idea how I was going to live with that. But maybe, for the first time, I understood that I didn't have to. Everything had fallen apart, but it wasn't over, not yet.